Howdy, and welcome back to COMM 350. In this unit, we'll be exploring media effects, a theoretical approach that looks at the effect of media on society. Now, one thing I haven't shared with you in the class yet is that one of the things I love about media theory is I like to say in the field of advertising, they often say it does what it says in the package. Media effects and media theory is like that. It's looking at the media's effect. So I encourage you over the course of this course, while you're looking at different approaches and maybe you get confused about, well, what is what about? Just like we look at propaganda studies, was studying propaganda, media effects is looking about the effect of media. So let's move on to lecture. So remember, the key terms for this unit are found on the key terms word video, where a fuller discussion, definition, explanation is given. So going into this unit is important for you to understand what media effects is, and also to be looking out for discussions of gatekeeping and agenda setting, cultivation. The idea of the Columbine effect will be discussed as an example of a media effects study, and the two-step flow or limited effects theory. So let's first start with a history behind media effects and the Columbine School. So the media effects approach emerged again in many ways as a response to the early starts of media theory. Scholars looking at the Chicago School and propaganda studies began to see that the media was an important area to study, but maybe their perspective didn't give the whole picture. Media effects approach was focused on moving from just looking at the content of the propaganda to looking at its impact on audiences. And so we again see this is where the chain of communication theoretical model and transmission model provides us with a way to kind of see there's different areas could be focused on. And so we see that the movement from just focus on the message to focus on the audience. Now, what's important to see is that people in media effects were coming from studies in psychology and sociology, areas and disciplines of academia that already had established kind of their own kind of ways of doing research and ways of studying different kinds of content. And so when they were looking at the audience, they were looking at not just as these are a group of people to study, but they're looking at it as a theoretical construct. They had a set of assumptions, these scholars, about how we should see the audience. And so their argument was that if we choose an audience, especially if we carefully choose, the age range, where they're coming from, we can take a small group of people and make them kind of an example, a representation of a given culture. So taking this approach, the idea was kind of trying to be very kind of scientific. Let's take a selection of people that represent a certain set of traits and attitudes and attributes. And so if they clearly share these kind of distinctions, we can assume that larger groups of people that have these same characteristics also would react in the same way. And so this was kind of going into the rationale of structuring media effects research. It was very kind of, again, coming out of psychology, very experiment oriented, trying to kind of create certain scenarios and conditions where like a group of people would watch a video and they look how they respond to them. Also, media effects in audiences, they're seen in two ways. One is that their particular perspective of these audiences is they want to see how a media audience that was created or constituted by mass media or consuming media would be influenced. And so they want to kind of especially look at not just the whole population and how they respond to messages, but they're looking at audiences that come together, maybe watching the same show, gathered around the same news station, and how they would be affected by mass media messages. And also media effects scholars came to the table thinking that understanding that how propaganda had influenced people with such assumptions that we're seeing a very strong connection between certain actions and the media. So we believe that the media messages have a strong effect on society. This wasn't just looking at kind of posters or propaganda that was specifically motivating people to one direction, but they began to see that things like news media and maybe certain kind of news stories can influence people, or things like advertising, and kind of how maybe that can, if we understand advertising, how that influences people to behave in some ways, and both kind of positive ways and negative ways. Like with the cigarette ad, a weapon of mass destruction, 5 million deaths per year. And the argument that, as people were watching more television, seeing characters smoking, they somehow subconsciously felt that smoking was legitimate and it was increasing smoking. And so these are the kind of things that media effects researchers wanted to interrogate and look at. So media effects research was concerned with with culture and media effects on audiences. So the idea that the media is promoting certain kinds of culture, certain kind of views of how should people interact, how should certain genders behave, how should people understand or respond to certain situations, whether it's the a fire in the community or a war across the world. So looking at the effects on audiences. So media effects researchers wanted to create conditions where they could study specific things. And some of the as early as well as continued interest of media effects researchers have been on kind of, especially the negative effects media can have on certain populations. So one idea is the influence of media on children. There was the assumption that young people don't have as refined rationale or decision-making abilities, so the media is going to have a strong influence on what they think or how they behave. Concerns about addiction, again, how might a movie showing people, taking drugs or having alcohol, might that encourage certain addictive behaviors or attitudes? And finally, what is there a connection between media consumption of media that has violent content and people's violent behavior? So these are some, again, core centers that have been, especially the study of children and the study of the connection of media and violence. So media effects, as I kind of noted before, because the scholars were coming out of psychology and some sociology, they wanted to create kind of a systematic method to discover something. And so again, they used a lot of what's called quantitative research and experimental. So one of the famous media effects studies, first one was called, where they would bring young children into a room and they would have them watch a cartoon that had some kind of violence, the characters kind of hitting each other or something. And then they would put them in a room with toys, and one of them would be what was called a Bobo doll. It was a doll that you could kind of punch, and you'd hit it, and then it would come back and wobble back and forth. And so they found in this study that young children who watched a cartoon that had this violence would often be violent toward that Bobo doll after seeing it. Where children who watched maybe a cartoon that didn't have violence in it were less likely to do that. And so these are kind of studies for them to kind of see, like, does media have an effect, and made them kind of make some research kind of connections that maybe there is something to this about media violence. Another method used by media effects research is quantitative research. And so this is kind of can be oftentimes survey based, where people will ask people to take a survey about how they react to certain media. Oftentimes, media effects researchers will have people involved in, like, playing a certain video game, watch a certain TV show or movie, or even just look at a clip of dialogue from a film, and then ask people to answer a question. And the idea is that if we get a broad enough sample of people that share certain characteristics, if we kind of can take away and say, okay, we can say that all young people being these ages would have these kind of characteristics, they responded this way. And so they can begin to make assumptions about how broader audiences would react to certain media content. So the headquarters, or the starting point of media effects research, it was the Columbia School, and the Columbia University, as in Columbia, New York. And so again, they were looking at the scholars in Chicago and began to see, okay, we see what you're doing. We see that it's important to study media, but we want to look at kind of measurable short-term behavioral effects. One of the concerns and critiques of the propaganda studies is that we're so interested in looking at the effect of the message itself. They often didn't look at, well, what effect was it having, or it was kind of unsystematic, where the scholar would say, well, this is how this media was interpreted. But they felt they needed to create a more scientific, controlled environment in order to kind of assess those behavioral reactions. So they strongly sought to identify, okay, media actions that strongly influence media audiences. So the cause was media, something happening in the media content, a certain media message was the cause, and they wanted to see what influence or effect it had on the audience. So this cause and effect relationship really guided how they did their surveys, how they did their experiments, and continues to guide many media effects scholars. The kind of father of media effects was Paul Lazarsfeld. This is not to be confused with Harold Laswell, who was one of the key figures in propaganda studies. Paul Lazarsfeld was a quantitative scholar. He came out of sociology, and he's also credited not just with being foundational in media studies, but also as one of the people who helped systematize sociology research. And sociology is the study of society. So he took some of those patterns and methods that were being developed for sociology and brought them into media studies. And again, he was interested in media, but especially how does mass media have persuasive elements? How does it persuade? And so when we use the term mass media, we're talking about the traditional non-digital media of film, television, radio, and newspapers. So what was the main difference between the Columbia and the Chicago School? Well, we've been hinting at it, but let's just talk about this really briefly in terms of the theories. So we said the Chicago School, they came up with the hypodermic needle theory, and the hypodermic needle theory was this idea that that media has a message and that it injects that information directly into the minds. So this is kind of a theory that media has this very direct effect, and especially into people's thinking. Again, some scholars later describe this as the magic bullet theory, and where the hypodermic needle was meant to emphasize this direct effect of hypodermic needle directed into the person. The magic bullet was to say like a bullet is powerful, so is the media. And so while the bullet shot at someone will have a direct effect, but also just emphasizing the power and especially the destructive power of media. So this is kind of thing. Well, this is different than what we see in the Columbia School in their first kind of theory that they put forth is limited effects. They still, again, very strongly agree that media is powerful in society, but they began to see that maybe there's some other conditions or other ways to look at it. And again, as a scholar, they needed to look at some of the kind of conditions that need to be set up in order for that effect to happen, not just assume every time the media turns on a story, we hear a song, we're going to have a direct effect on that. So let's go look at Lazarsfeld's limited effects theory. So this is, again, Lazarsfeld, his kind of first step into theory. And so again, kind of critiquing some of the propaganda studies, he came up with the limited effects theory and the two-step flow media model. So remember, media models are kind of visual representations of a theory. It's a way to kind of provide a picture to help us kind of more clearly understand what is being explained. So if you look down in the bottom, here's the two-step flow model. And so this particular model was developed out of a study of people's voting patterns in the 1940s. So Lazarsfeld was studying how people kind of reported their voting and also what kind of forces related to the media influenced them. And so what he found is in his survey, when he was surveying people, that the flow from media to opinion leaders impacted the wider population. So what does this mean? So, whereas propaganda studies would say, oh yeah, it's the message, it's the media message, and then the people are directly affected. And he's saying, well, what he found is that voters were influenced rather than just by the media messages, that if those media messages were presented by an opinion leader, they were given much more credence and adherence by the people. So if we looked at this media, the two-step flow, we have the mass media, and then we see these kind of bigger circles. Those would be the opinion leaders. That could be like a politician. That could be, in contemporary kind of context, it could be a celebrity. It could be somebody with kind of notoriety, like a former political figure. And so when the mass media, people from the opinion leaders take on things or accept things from the mass media, and then they share that with people, those people are much more likely to kind of, again, adhere to accept that material and kind of be affected by it, rather than if the media just went directly to the audience. And so it says that what we need to pay attention to is not just the media, but who is sharing the media. And so for him, Lazarsfeld also identifies this idea of there's leaders or opinion leaders, and when they kind of grasp the media or take on ideas of the media, they in many ways serve as gatekeepers. If they share that information that they receive, then that means they're opening the gate, as it were, to let other people and those ideas out to the public. If they kind of hear information, they say, "Oh no, that's not important," or "Oh, I don't believe that," then in fact they're kind of setting they're shutting the gate. And so this is where we'll talk a little bit later about the idea of gatekeeping, the idea of ideas going in and out, being controlled. So again, what we see in Lazarsfeld's perspective here is kind of a slight nuanced difference, that he's saying that it's not just the media and a message, that it's kind of the context and the culture that's created. So Chicago school, they believe that media influence was all powerful, and it had a direct effect on audience. Where Columbia Effect said, well, media does have influence, but it can be limited or influenced by other factors. And so they felt like we need to look a little bit at the culture or kind of what other things are happening in there. Media also, they can have an indirect effect. And this is like what we see in the limited effects, the two-step flow model. So we see that, when the message was mediated through the leader, it had much greater impact on the audience. And so again, this makes it indirect effect. There was a step in between the media and that. And so this kind of shows more nuance. So it's much more developed and nuanced way of thinking about media. So we see that, from the Columbia School, they had a number of contributions to media theory, ones that I've kind of mentioned here. So one of them is the first one of Lazarsfeld's looking at limited effects of mass media, so that there's certain kind of conditions or other factors that have to be looked at for that influence people's response to media. We mentioned the idea of gatekeeping. So he realized from this particular study how the idea that the media serve as gatekeepers, and was they, for if they share information or they put it on the 6 o'clock news, as it were, or it comes on the front page of the CNN or Fox Media website, that gives people a sense that, oh, this is important to pay attention to. They basically either open the gate or shut the gate to stories. They often are the place where information becomes news or not news. We also see that the idea of agenda setting is terms. And so just because news goes through the gate doesn't mean that it's all treated the same. So the media also play this role in setting the agenda by how they cover different stories. And finally, cultivation theory is something we'll talk about, really into this idea about how that media cultivate or creates a certain kind of response, or kind of guides us in a certain direction. So these are some of the key media theories. So right now, and in the lecture, we've gone over kind of the basics of the media effects and the Columbia School. At this point, you should be able to describe what are the two differences between the Chicago and Columbia School's beliefs about media. And you should be able to not just read the slide that I show you, but really understand those differences. If you don't, please go back and look at the reading, or please go back and listen to parts of this first part of the lecture.